Let's get right to the new developments today in the war in Ukraine. This morning, no signs of progress after a new round of talks to end the violence between the foreign ministers of Ukraine, Russia, and Turkey in the Turkish city of Antalya. This as Russian forces intensify their attacks on key Ukrainian cities. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky claiming proof of genocide by the Russians after a bombing in Mariupol yesterday that leveled a maternity and children's hospital. Mariupol officials say at least 3 people died in the attack, including a child.
He started shouting, "Stop! There are children here! Stop!" But they didn't stop and kept shooting. 3 or 4 people were shooting, just as close as you're sitting right now.
Along the Ukrainian border, the humanitarian crisis keeps growing. The United Nations now estimating more than 2.2 million people have fled to neighboring countries. Many of the refugees, women whose husbands stayed to fight, fleeing with their children.
Kids shouldn't see the murder. They shouldn't hear the bombs falling on their city. That's why we are here, hoping that something will change, that our army will stand till the end.
This morning, Ukrainian officials have now announced 7 humanitarian corridors to get citizens out of the hardest hit areas. President Zelensky says yesterday nearly 35,000 people were rescued through evacuation routes. And today, Vice President Kamala Harris is in Poland to meet with Ukrainian refugees and U.S. soldiers. She'll also meet with the Polish president after the U.S. rejected Poland's offer to transfer custody of Soviet-era fighter jets to help Ukraine defend itself against Russia. We have a team of correspondents and analysts monitoring the latest developments, including our Josh Letterman in Warsaw for the vice president's visit there, and NBC News correspondent Ali Aruzzi in Lviv, Ukraine. Also, national security analyst Clint Watts tracking the movements of Russian forces. Ali, let's start with you. Mariupol had been one of the hardest hit cities in Ukraine even before this maternity hospital was bombed. What's the situation like over there this morning?
Good morning, Joe. That's right. It was very hard hit from the beginning of this war, and it continues to be pounded. Yesterday, Russian forces destroyed a maternity ward and a children's ward at a hospital in Mariupol. As you mentioned earlier, there are 3 confirmed deaths, amongst them a child. 17 other people were also said to be injured in that attack, amongst them doctors, nurses, and tragically women waiting to give birth in that hospital. The World Health Organization says that 2 other hospitals east of Kyiv had also been targeted, and they confirmed that 18 medical facilities since the beginning of this war have been targeted. And it's also raised a chorus of condemnation. President Zelensky, speaking yesterday in Russian, called it a war crime. He said in Russian that what kind of a country is Russia, that they're afraid of a hospital and a children's ward. The municipality in Mariupol says that the scene there is apocalyptic. There's no electricity, water, gas, and people are really struggling to survive there. So it's a very, very tragic situation in Mariupol, and most of the 400,000 residents of that city appear to be trapped there right now. There is no way for them to get out. So it's a very, very difficult situation for the people there right now.
Ali, President Zelensky also said yesterday 35,000 people were evacuated via 3 humanitarian corridors. Today, Ukraine says it's opening 7 of these routes. How have these evacuations been going so far? Are officials concerned at all by the slow progress?
That's right. Well, actually, President Zelensky upped that number just a few minutes ago. He said about 60,000 people have now been evacuated from across the country. But as we spoke, around Mariupol, Kyiv, Rumi, which have been hit very badly. These are the very, very intense war zones. People are trapped there, or they're unable to travel. So a lot of people have traveled from countries, areas closer to the west. And we saw, an exodus of people while we were crossing the Polish border into Ukraine. There was a long line of buses of people that had managed to get out of Ukraine into Poland, mostly women and children, many of them with their pets. And Joe, I have to say, those are the lucky lucky ones. You know, they have some of the means to get out. It's not cheap to evacuate from your home. You have to have some money in your pocket to pay for accommodation, food, look after your children and your pets. So the situation for the rest of the people in the East is very difficult. It's not moving as quickly as everybody has hoped. And the Russians are just not opening these humanitarian corridors. The Ukrainian authorities here are asking them to honor their promise and let civilians out, but it's just not moving quickly enough.
Yeah, that new video from Zelensky you just mentioned, Ali, more than 60,000 people deported from occupied territories yesterday. Zelensky also saying Russia wants to humiliate our people so they kneel and take bread and water from the hands of the occupiers. I want to ask you, Ali, the Russian and Ukrainian foreign ministers met earlier today in Turkey for the first high-level talks since this conflict began. Expectations were low going into the meeting. Anything come out of it?
That's right. The expectations were low, and those expectations were met. The Ukrainian foreign minister said that he didn't think the Russians were in a position to embark on a ceasefire. They're still making demands that the Ukrainians are not going to accept, like jurisdiction over Crimea, a legal document saying that they're not going to join NATO, to recognize separatist states. The Ukrainians saying that this is utter humiliation, so they are not going to accept those proposals as it stands. So the talks really didn't get anywhere today.
All right, Ali Arouzi in Lviv. Ali, thank you so much.
Let's now get to Clint Watts for more on the situation on the ground in Ukraine. He's a distinguished research fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and an NBC News national security analyst. Clint, good morning. We love having you join us on this. So let's start with these Russian bombings of hospitals around Ukraine. Just these absolutely devastating images. We know how bad the attack in Mariupol was, and Russians actually also shelled several hospitals in a city that's to the west of Kyiv, so really the other side of the country from Mariupol. But walk us through where these attacks are taking place, what this says about a change in strategy, a willingness to go after places like this, places where civilians are, places where pregnant women are, and why Russia has resorted to these types of tactics.
Yes, I think we're at that point where it's siege warfare. You're seeing it here in Mariupol. That city is completely surrounded. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of people that need to flee. Yesterday, what you saw was this hospital here. This is that footage that you're seeing on video. This is that courtyard, essentially, that was hit with that airstrike. Massive devastation to all these buildings around there. This is inciting fear in the population, essentially trying to scare them essentially out of these towns. And I think that speaks to a bigger problem that we're starting to see emerge, which is here in the east. We focused a lot on the military up north and the military down south, but in these eastern cities, they're basically surrounded. There's still resistance fighting going on in some locations, and that's why you're seeing talk of these evacuation corridors. The big problem with these evacuation corridors is it's very difficult to move hundreds of thousands of people internally into Ukraine, and then where are they going to? Ultimately, they're still not far off the front lines, and they could be enveloped by advancing Russian forces over time. So very dire situation in the east, and something we definitely need to keep our eyes on.
Clint, let's talk more about evacuations in general. I think as we hear this number of refugees growing, 2.2 million is the latest from the UN. I think a lot of people might be thinking, it seems like a lot of people got out. They're not there. But that's, in fact, not the case. A lot of people are still in these cities in the east. People who didn't have family in neighboring countries like Poland and didn't automatically think, I should leave my home because they didn't have anywhere to go. Which cities are still unable to get people out due to these continued attacks, due to these intensified attacks? And is there any hope for these evacuation routes that can change soon?
So some of that field reporting you had on right before, some excellent points, which is those that can get out are usually those that have their own transportation first. You remember the first days of the war, those streams of cars going down the highway, moving to the west. Who else can do it? Those with sufficient money that they can move and know that wherever they land, they have something to take care of themselves. Those left behind are those that don't necessarily have the means. Maybe they're older. You see lots of elderly people in some of these hospitals. They obviously can't go or move very far. And then we were talking about that maternity ward. So I think when you look at the current situation, you're seeing here in the east, the Russians are basically advancing in corridors, kind of in this arc. You're seeing them advance from Sumy, trying to take Dnipro, from Dnipro in the south. If they do that, they'll have taken over all of the eastern part of the country. If that is the case, each of these cities will be laid to siege warfare like we're seeing in Mariupol, where essentially they've got to try and escape. So I think that for those that remain there, there's millions of people in these cities and towns. Getting back further to the west is going to be a big challenge in the coming days and weeks.
Clint, we're now 2 weeks into this war. You mentioned this has sort of changed to these siege tactics, siege warfare. Walk us through where you see this strategy going. I hate to have to ask this question, but how much worse we could see things turn in some of these cities in the east, as well as Russia makes advances into the country. And what do you think this means for some of these urban areas with heavy shelling? How long can Ukrainians hold out in some of these urban areas?
That's right. Well, the place we're focused on, again, is Kyiv. And when you look at the Kyiv map, kind of on scale, out here to the east, Refugee, we're now starting to see Russian troops make their way there in skirmishes. We were already talking for the last 2 weeks about this convoy out to the northwest. Well, we're starting to see how this unfolds. If you look at the axes of advance here in the north, right now you see almost 3 prongs starting to come into the city. This is the convoy up here to the northwest. It's been advancing, stalled out, struggling and having trouble. But yesterday, there were reports that they were moving out here to the west, which would mean that they could start to envelop from the west and the northwest. Separately, from Sumy, we had that axis of advance. In Brovary here, you're starting to see those skirmishes as they try and move armor forces in on this highway. Separately, Zalicia up here to the north, same thing. You're starting to see this sort of combat. So if they can come in and encircle the city over time, this will take days and weeks, but over time, they'll be able to do a siege to Kyiv, much like they've done in Mariupol and other locations.
All right, Clint Watts, thank you so much. We appreciate you walking us through this to kick us off every morning. Now, this morning, Vice President Kamala Harris is meeting with leaders in Poland to discuss the crisis in Ukraine. While a major aim of the trip is to present a united front against Russia's invasion, the visit comes one day after the Department of Defense rejected Poland's plan to give Soviet-era fighter jets to the United States to then give to Ukraine. NBC News correspondent Josh Letterman joins us now from the Polish capital of Warsaw. Josh, good morning. So some viewers may have just heard that and thought, what is that plan? What does that mean? It was this plan to transfer those jets to this U.S. base in Germany so that then essentially it was on the U.S. to pass them over to Ukraine. Is that whole plan officially dead? Is that not going to happen anymore, this transfer of these jets that Ukraine has asked for?
It was dead and it was never alive to begin with, Savannah, according to the Pentagon, which says the idea of putting these planes in U.S. custody is a non-starter, not only because shipping them from a U.S. base in Germany to Ukraine could be seen by the Russians as directly implicating the United States military in a war with Russia, but also because of the logistical and, frankly, safety considerations around who would then fly them into Ukraine, given the fact that there are significant Russian anti-aircraft capabilities pretty much across the country of Ukraine right now, meaning if it was U.S. pilots flying those planes, they could potentially be shot down by the Russians. And so Harris, on her trip here to Poland, is going to have to smooth over this diplomatic rift that's opened between the U.S. and Poland. U.S. officials saying this is only a temporary glitch in the relationship, that basically the Poles were trying to help. They got a little ahead on their skis. They put forward a proposal that was not tenable as far as the U.S. is concerned, but that the security relationship and the NATO partnership is still very strong. Harris saying this earlier this morning when she met with Prime Minister Duda. Take a listen.
We will discuss many issues today, and it will include the ongoing commitment that the United States has to support of this region, including the people of Ukraine, that ranges from security assistance to humanitarian assistance.
And as we are speaking, Savannah, Harris is holding a news conference with the Polish leader where just seconds ago, she once again affirmed the U.S. commitment to NATO, to defending, as Harris put it, every inch of NATO territory, saying the U.S. takes its Article 5 commitments extremely seriously. She's also talking about these 2 Patriot missile batteries the U.S. is now putting into Poland, not to be used in Ukraine, to be used here in Poland to help them shoot down missiles if it were to to ever come to that. But clearly, the U.S. and Poland both hoping it will not come to that Putin's aggression will not extend beyond Ukraine. But Harris trying to send the message both here and in her next stop in Romania that the U.S. is very firmly committed to the defense of the alliance. Savannah?
Article 5, of course, being that clause that means that NATO countries are committed to defending each other. And that really is the issue here. Ukraine is not a NATO country, and therefore coming to their defense means direct involvement by NATO. In terms of President Putin's perspective on this. So let's talk, though, about what can be done, because the Ukrainian President Zelensky has repeatedly asked for those jets, which was the plan that you just talked through and how we really don't have any progress on it, or a no-fly zone, meaning essentially NATO forces close the sky over Ukraine, which has similar concerns to what you just said in terms of involvement as well as the danger it puts NATO troops in. So far, the U.S. has refused to do either in an effort to avoid that direct conflict. But the House passed government funding bill that includes nearly $14 billion in aid for Ukraine. Tell us about that aid and also explain just how blurry this line is. Why can we do that aid, but we can't help in this way? What does that ultimately mean? President Putin thinks about that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Savannah. Well, let's start with that no-fly zone. I think we should explain to viewers, when we talk about imposing a no-fly zone, that means that if the Russians then fly into Ukrainian airspace, U.S. pilots are supposed to shoot those planes down. That would clearly bring the U.S. into direct military confrontation with nuclear-armed Russia, something the Biden administration says is not going to happen. Now, sending them planes, fighter jets, is slightly less significant of a step, but still one that brings the U.S. more into this conflict. But there are real questions about, look, if we're sending them all of these billions of dollars of lethal weaponry, doesn't that bring the U.S. to some degree into this conflict as well? The U.S. trying to walk this fine line, finding ways to help the Ukrainians fight the Russians without bringing the U.S. too far into this. And so you see them trying to strike that balance, Savannah.
Josh Letterman, as always, thank you so much.
The destruction in Ukraine is creating a refugee crisis not seen in Europe since the Second World War. The UN estimates now 2.2 million people have fled Ukraine since the war began. Countries like Slovakia and Hungary are seeing hundreds of thousands of refugees, but no country is seeing more traffic than Poland, where 1.2 million refugees have landed so far, mostly women and children. NBC News senior national correspondent Jay Gray has been following that story for us. He joins us now from a refugee processing center in Poland. Jay, good to have you with us again. When we saw you yesterday, you mentioned this center. It didn't even exist before the war. What are you seeing there on the ground today?
Well, Joe, we actually have moved to the border crossing here, Medica. This is the spot where most of those are making the crossing. And you can see the fencing behind me. That's the actual line. That's where Poland starts, and that's where people are making to walk to freedom. I want to show you what they see as they take those first steps into this country after what for many has been a desperate, a very difficult journey. Walking down this footpath, you can see 2 days ago, Joe, these tents weren't here. There were empty fields on either side of this footpath, but volunteers had poured in with food, with clothing, with blankets, with anything they can grab to try and help those who so desperately need this help. And you can see the crowds here. They have been building. We continue to see so many people walking through this area. And at the end of this footpath, there's a bus that comes at random times. Obviously, there's no bus schedule for all of this. The red tents behind me, these are doctors. These are medics who are here to help those who may need some assistance after a long journey. We're talking to these families as they come through. It's bitterly cold. They've been coming through snow. Some of the women carrying their children for 2 and 3 days just to get to this spot. And really, Joe, they get here, and there's such an excitement. We've seen some real emotion from those who cross the border here. But they also understand it's just the beginning of what continues to be a very difficult journey for so many.
So, Jay, you've been there for a few days now. Do you get the sense that these operations, this response, is getting more organized day by day?
Yeah. Oh, I definitely think so. In the beginning, it was very scattered, and it was just catch as catch can. And now there seems to be a system to all of this. And I think it's because we've seen more people move in, more people who know how to run this type of operation and to help this type of operation. Obviously, it's going to be needed for quite some time. You can see it right here. I mean, their families just getting what they can. These are supplies, toiletries that they will need as they move forward, and just so many donations piling in that they had to figure out a way to make all of this work. And you're right, it is much more organized at this point. The question's going to become, and the rub's going to be, when the crowd becomes too big for this area to manage, when they don't have enough supplies to give to those who are moving through. And it's already pushed to its limits. We do continue to see volunteers and donations moving in, but we know that the crowds coming are large, and it's going to be very difficult.
Right, Jay Gray giving us a look at what's happening there on the border with Poland. Thank you so much, as always, Jay. Now, while Russia and Ukraine have reached that tentative deal to let civilians evacuate using those 7 humanitarian corridors, making that happen is another issue. How do countries go about creating a safe path for civilians to travel during a war? NBC News correspondent Stephanie Gosk takes a closer look at how the corridors work.
Russia and Ukraine have finally agreed on protected escape routes for Ukrainian civilians after a lot of wrangling. They're called humanitarian corridors. It works by securing a ceasefire for a long enough time so that families and other civilians can flee the war zone unharmed, getting out to safety. The corridors also allow humanitarian aid to get in for those people staying behind. The first humanitarian corridors of the modern era were attempted in the Bosnian conflict in 1992. But UN soldiers and Bosnian civilians often came under fire from Serbian forces. One UN report found the corridors, which included the Sarajevo airport, allowed the Serbs to control incoming aid. More recently, humanitarian corridors were used during the civil war in Syria, which the Russians were deeply involved in. By 2016, Russian and Syrian fighters were often accused of violating the ceasefire agreements and bombing the corridors. Fast forward to now, the Russians and Ukrainians tried to come to an agreement on safe passage last week, but the Russian proposal only allowed civilians to escape to Russia or its ally, Belarus. Finally, transports by the Red Cross successfully traveled Ukraine's first humanitarian corridor. The problem for the people of Ukraine now is that humanitarian corridors can only work if they are trusted. Ukrainian leadership says previous ceasefires have been violated. So the question is, will families and other civilians be willing to take the risk of using the corridors if they aren't sure they are safe?
Our thanks to Stephanie Gosk for that report.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.